between Europe and Asia, where a narrow ribbon of water connects two great seas, there stands a city that has watched the rise and fall of empires for more than 16 centuries. Today it is known as Istanbul, but for much of history it was called Constantinople, a place where merchants, emperors, pilgrims, and explorers all passed through its gates. Here, ships once crowded the waters of the Golden Horn, while towering above the city rose the great dome of Hagia Sophia, shining in the sunlight like a beacon over the ancient world. For more than 1,000 years, this remarkable city stood at the crossroads of continents, a meeting place of cultures, religions, and ideas. And its story is one of the most extraordinary in human history. For centuries, Constantinople was considered one of the most secure cities on earth. Protected by enormous stone fortifications known as the Theodosian Walls, the city resisted siege after siege. Armies came from many lands, yet again and again they failed to break through its defenses. For nearly 1,000 years, these walls stood as an almost unbreakable barrier between the city and the outside world. Welcome to Dreamy Night Facts, a place where history slows down, stories unfold gently, and the past becomes a quiet journey through time. Tonight, we're traveling to a remarkable city that once stood at the very crossroads of the ancient world, a place where Europe and Asia nearly touch, where ships from distant seas passed through narrow waters, and where empires rose and fell across more than 16 centuries. As we explore the story of Constantinople, allow yourself to settle in, relax, and simply listen as the history of this extraordinary city unfolds. If you enjoy calm journeys through the past like this one, you might like to subscribe to Dreamy Night Facts and join us again on future travels through history. Now, take a slow breath, get comfortable, and let our story begin. The narrow passage between continents. Where Europe and Asia almost touch, a narrow stretch of water flows quietly toward the sea. This waterway is known as the Bosporus Strait, a slender channel that links the great inland waters of the Black Sea with the wider Mediterranean world. For thousands of years, ships have traveled along this passage. From the north came vessels carrying grain, timber, and furs from distant lands around the Black Sea. From the south arrived merchants bearing olive oil, wine, spices, and silk from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Bosporus became one of the great maritime crossroads of the ancient world, a place where trade routes and cultures naturally converged. Along the western side of this strait lies a remarkable natural harbour known as the Golden Horn. Curving gently inland like a protective arm, the Golden Horn forms a deep sheltered inlet where ships could anchor safely away from the open sea. The geography of this place is quietly extraordinary. To the east flows the Bosporus, carrying ships between two seas. To the north lies the Golden Horn, a harbour naturally shielded from storms and waves. And beyond these waters rise gentle hills that provide commanding views across the surrounding landscape. For ancient sailors and traders, such a location was invaluable. Ships travelling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had little choice but to pass through this narrow corridor. Whoever controlled this stretch of water could watch, regulate, and profit from the steady flow of commerce moving between continents. Over time, Caravans from Asia and ships from Europe began to converge here. Traders exchanged goods, languages mixed, ideas passed quietly from one culture to another. The meeting point of land routes and sea routes slowly transformed this narrow strait into something far more significant than a simple passage of water. It became a gateway between seas, between continents, and between worlds. Long before emperors and armies arrived, before great churches and palaces were built, the geography itself had already chosen this place for greatness. The narrow passage between continents would one day become the setting for one of the most remarkable cities in human history. But that city did not yet exist. For now, the winds still moved quietly across the hills, and the waters of the Bosporus flowed steadily between Europe and Asia, waiting for the first settlers who would recognize the extraordinary promise of this land. Before Constantinople, the Greek city of Byzantium. Long before emperors built palaces and great domes rose above the skyline, this narrow passage between continents was home to a much smaller settlement. In the 7th century BC, Greek sailors exploring the northern seas began searching for new places to establish trading colonies. Many of these settlers came from the ancient city of Megara, a maritime community whose people were skilled navigators and merchants. According to tradition, around the year 657 BC, a group of these settlers arrived at the entrance to the Bosporus and founded a new colony they called Byzantium. To the Greeks, the location must have seemed almost ideal. The waters of the Bosporus Strait teemed with fish, especially migrating tuna that passed through the channel in great seasonal schools. Small fishing boats could easily harvest these waters, providing a reliable source of food for the growing settlement. The sheltered inlet of the Golden Horn also offered a safe anchorage for trading vessels. Protected from strong winds and open seas, ships could dock and unload cargo, while merchants conducted business along the quiet waterfront. Gradually, Byzantium became more than just a fishing village. It grew into a modest but active trading post, where sailors from many lands paused on their journeys. Goods passed through the harbor from distant regions, grain from the northern shores of the Black Sea, timber from forested lands to the east, and wine and olive oil from the Greek world to the south. The settlement itself likely consisted of narrow streets, simple homes built of stone and wood, and small temples dedicated to the gods of the Greek world. Fishermen rose early each morning to push their boats into the calm waters of the Bosporus, while traders waited along the harbor for ships arriving from distant ports. Over time, the people of Byzantium developed a quiet prosperity. Its citizens learned that their true wealth lay not in vast farmlands or large armies, but in their remarkable position between two great regions of the world. Ships traveling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had little choice but to pass close to this small city. From its harbors and the watchful hills, the inhabitants of Byzantium could observe the steady movement of vessels that carried the lifeblood of ancient commerce. Though still modest in size, Byzantium had already begun to benefit from the powerful geography that would shape its destiny for centuries to come. The settlers who built this small Greek colony could not have known that their quiet trading town would one day grow into one of the greatest cities on earth. For now, Byzantium remained a peaceful harbor settlement, a place of fishermen, merchants, and sailors, standing quietly at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, long before the arrival of emperors and empires. The Roman Empire looks east. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire stretched across vast lands. Its territories extended from the cold frontiers of northern Europe to the deserts of the Middle East, from the Atlantic Ocean to the distant shores of the Black Sea. Governing such an enormous empire had always been a challenge, and over time, the old capital of Rome was no longer ideally placed to manage it. Much of the empire's wealth and population had gradually shifted eastward. Important trade routes connected the eastern Mediterranean to Persia, Arabia, and lands even farther away. And along these routes lay the narrow waterway known as the Bosporus Strait. Ships carrying grain, timber, wine, silk, and precious goods moved through these waters every day. For the people who lived in the small city of Byzantium, this movement of trade had long been part of daily life. Fishing boats still worked the currents of the Bosporus, just as they had for generations. Merchants waited along the harbor for ships arriving from distant ports. To them, the steady rhythm of trade and travel was simply the ordinary pattern of the sea. But in the early 4th century, one man began to see this place very differently. That man was the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. Constantine ruled during a time of profound change within the empire. Civil wars had recently shaken the Roman world, and the emperor understood that controlling the eastern provinces would be essential for stability. From a strategic perspective, Byzantium possessed an extraordinary advantage. Its position allowed whoever ruled the city to monitor ships moving between two great seas. To the north lay the Black Sea, connected to fertile lands that produced enormous quantities of grain. To the south stretched the Mediterranean, linking dozens of thriving cities and trading centers. The small settlement of Byzantium stood quietly between them, a gateway between worlds. And Constantine began to imagine something remarkable. He envisioned transforming this modest harbor town into a new imperial capital, a city that would stand at the crossroads of continents. For a moment, imagine the scene as it may have appeared nearly 17 centuries ago. A cool breeze moves across the waters of the Bosporus. Fishing boats drift quietly near the shoreline. Beyond them, the hills rise gently above the harbor. From these hills, one can see ships entering the strait from both directions, from the Black Sea to the north, and from the Mediterranean to the south. For a moment, allow your thoughts to slow. Picture the calm water moving steadily through the narrow channel, ships passing quietly between continents. Breathing slowly, imagine the rhythm of the sea that has flowed through this place for thousands of years. When Constantine looked across these waters, he saw more than a harbor town. he saw the future center of an empire. According to later historians, the emperor personally walked the hills of Byzantium, marking out the boundaries of the city he intended to build. New walls would be constructed. Great public squares would rise where fishermen's houses once stood. Temples, palaces, and churches would soon transform the skyline. What had once been a modest Greek trading settlement would soon become something far greater. A new capital, a new center of power. And in time, the world would know this city by a new name, Constantinople. But that transformation was only just beginning. For the moment, the waters of the Bosporus still flowed quietly past the small harbor of Byzantium, unaware that history was about to change the destiny of this place forever. The birth of a new capital. In the early 4th century, the small city of Byzantium stood quietly beside the waters of the Bosporus Strait. Fishing boats moved slowly across the currents. Merchant ships arrived from distant ports, and along the sheltered curve of the Golden Horn, traders unloaded goods that had traveled across the ancient world. For generations, this had been a modest but prosperous harbor town. But in the year 330 AD, its destiny changed forever. The Roman Emperor, Constantine the Great, made the decision to transform Byzantium into a new imperial capital. Rather than rule his empire from distant Rome, Constantine chose this strategic crossroads between continents. Here, he would build a city worthy of imperial power. Construction began quickly. Workers expanded the existing walls and built new fortifications across the hills. Broad streets were laid out across the city. Public squares, known as forums, were constructed where citizens could gather. Temples, palaces, baths, and administrative buildings soon began to rise above the harbor. The transformation of Byzantium into Constantinople had begun. Yet Constantine did not intend this to be simply another Roman city. He envisioned a capital that reflected the changing character of the empire itself. In previous centuries, the Roman world had been shaped largely by traditional pagan beliefs. But under Constantine, Christianity began to emerge as a powerful new force within the empire. Churches were built throughout the growing city, and Christian symbols appeared alongside older Roman traditions. Constantinople would become not only a political capital, but also an important center of a changing religious world. Pause for a moment and imagine the scene during these early years of construction. Across the hills overlooking the Bosporus, the sounds of builders echo through the streets. Stone blocks are lifted into place. Columns rise slowly toward the sky. Along the harbor, ships continue to arrive with cargo and travelers from distant lands. But now the city feels different. There is a sense of movement, of anticipation, as if something much larger is beginning to take shape. Take a slow breath and picture the waters of the Bosporus flowing quietly beside this growing city. For the people who lived here, these years must have felt like living inside a moment of transformation. On May 11th, 330 AD, Constantine formally dedicated the city as his new capital. The ceremony marked the official founding of Constantinople, a city that would soon become one of the most powerful and influential centers in the world. Statues from across the Roman Empire were brought to decorate its squares. Great monuments were erected to celebrate its imperial status. And the city quickly began attracting merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and officials from many different lands. Over time, Constantinople would grow far beyond the size of the original settlement of Byzantium. Its harbors filled with ships, its markets filled with goods from distant continents, and its skyline gradually rose with churches, palaces, and fortifications. What had once been a quiet Greek trading town had become something entirely new. A capital between continents, a meeting place of cultures, and the center of a new chapter in the long story of the Roman world. Yet even as this remarkable city grew, challenges still lay ahead. For empires rise slowly, but they must constantly adapt to survive. And in the centuries to come, Constantinople would face wars, political struggles, and moments of great triumph. But for now, in the year 330 AD, the city stood proudly beside the Bosporus, newly founded, full of promise, and ready to begin its long journey through history. A Christian capital emerges. When Constantine the Great dedicated his new capital in the year 330 AD, the city of Constantinople was already beginning to develop a distinct character. Unlike the ancient city of Rome, whose traditions had been shaped over many centuries of pagan worship and imperial history, Constantinople emerged during a time of religious change within the empire. Christianity, once a small and sometimes persecuted faith, was now becoming increasingly influential. And the new capital beside the Bosporus Strait would soon reflect that transformation. In earlier generations, Christians had often practiced their faith quietly, sometimes meeting in private homes or modest gathering places. But under Constantine, the situation began to change dramatically. In 313 AD, the Edict of Milan allowed Christians to worship freely throughout the empire. As Constantinople expanded, churches began appearing across the growing city. Some were modest buildings serving local communities. Others were far grander structures designed to reflect the importance of the new capital. For a moment, imagine the city during one of its early evenings. The sun is slowly setting beyond the western hills. Soft light reflects across the waters of the Golden Horn. Fishing boats return toward the harbor after a long day on the water. And along the streets, lamps begin to glow. Take a slow breath and picture the calm rhythm of life in this early capital. For the people living here, Constantinople was still a young city. Yet it was already beginning to feel important. As the decades passed, the influence of Christianity within the city continued to grow. Constantinople gradually developed its own religious leadership, and the bishop of the city eventually became known as the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. This position would become one of the most significant roles in the Christian world, placing Constantinople alongside cities such as Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch as major centers of Christian thought and leadership. At the same time, the city continued expanding physically. New neighborhoods appeared along the hills above the harbor. Markets grew larger and more diverse. Administrative buildings housed officials responsible for governing the eastern provinces of the empire. Gradually, Constantinople began to take on the appearance of a true imperial capital. Its population grew steadily. Its harbor became one of the busiest in the Mediterranean, and its influence began spreading far beyond the narrow peninsula on which it stood. Yet, Constantinople was still evolving. Its buildings were still relatively new, its institutions still developing, and its identity as a Christian imperial capital was only beginning to form. In the centuries ahead, emperors would expand the city even further, constructing monumental churches, massive defensive walls, and magnificent public spaces that would make Constantinople one of the greatest cities in the medieval world. Among those future rulers, one emperor would stand out above the rest. His reign would mark one of the most extraordinary periods in the city's long history. Under his leadership, Constantinople would reach a new height of power, beauty, and ambition. His name was Justinian I, and the age that followed would become known as one of the golden chapters in the story of Constantinople. The golden age of Emperor Justinian. By the early 6th century, the city of Constantinople had grown into one of the most important cities in the world. Its harbors were crowded with ships from across the Mediterranean. Its markets were filled with traders from distant lands, and its position along the narrow waters of the Bosporus Strait continued to make it one of the great crossroads of commerce and culture. Yet the city was about to enter one of the most remarkable periods in its long history. In the year 527 AD, a new emperor came to the throne. His name was Justinian. Justinian was an ambitious and determined ruler. He believed the empire should once again reach the greatness of ancient Rome. Armies were sent across the Mediterranean. Generals fought campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and Spain. For a time, the empire stretched across vast lands once again. But Justinian's ambitions were not limited to military victories. He also believed that Constantinople itself should reflect the power and prestige of the empire. And so he began one of the most ambitious building programs the city had ever seen. For a moment, imagine the city during those years of rebuilding. The smoke of the riots has faded. Across the hills of Constantinople, the sound of the construction echoes once again. Stone blocks are carried through the streets. Workers raise scaffolding toward the sky. Slowly, the city begins to transform. Take a quiet breath and picture the harbor of the Golden Horn in the early morning light. Ships arrive quietly from distant ports while the city rebuilds itself above the water. The building of Hagia Sophia. In the years following the destruction caused by the Nika riots, large areas of Constantinople lay in ruins. Fires had swept through parts of the city. Public buildings had been damaged or destroyed. Among the structures lost in the turmoil was the earlier cathedral that once stood at the heart of the capital. For the Emperor Justinian I, rebuilding the city became an opportunity to create something far greater than before. Rather than reconstruct the previous church, Justinian ordered the construction of a new cathedral, one that would surpass every other church in the Christian world. This building would become known as Hagia Sophia, a name that means holy wisdom. To design the cathedral, Justinian chose two remarkable scholars and architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. Both men were known not only for their knowledge of architecture, but also for their understanding of mathematics and engineering. Their task was extraordinary. The emperor wanted a structure larger and more magnificent than any church built before, and he wanted it completed quickly. Work began in 532 AD. Only weeks after the riots had ended, thousands of laborers, craftsmen, and builders gathered in the center of the city. Stone was brought from distant quarries. Marble columns arrived from ancient temples across the empire. Materials traveled from many regions: Greece, Anatolia, Egypt, and beyond, all destined for the new cathedral rising above Constantinople. The architects devised a design unlike anything seen before. At the heart of the structure would be a vast dome, rising high above the central space of the church. Instead of resting on thick walls, the dome would appear to float above a ring of windows that allowed light to pour into the interior. This innovative design created an effect that astonished visitors. From inside the cathedral, the dome seemed almost suspended in the air. Light streamed through the windows beneath it, illuminating the great space below. For many who entered the building, the experience felt almost otherworldly. For a moment, imagine stepping into Hagia Sophia during the early years after its completion. The doors open slowly. You walk inside, and the enormous interior space stretches upward above you. Columns of colored marble rise toward the ceiling. High overhead, the great dome spreads across the sky of the cathedral. Sunlight filters through the ring of windows at its base, casting soft light across the golden mosaics that decorate the walls. Take a slow breath and imagine the quiet atmosphere within the church. Voices echo gently beneath the vast ceiling. Candles flicker along the aisles. For those who entered this place more than 15 centuries ago, it must have felt like standing beneath a piece of heaven itself. The construction of Hagia Sophia was completed in 537 AD after only 5 years of building, an astonishing achievement for such an enormous structure. When the cathedral was finally finished, Justinian himself attended the dedication ceremony. According to later historians, the emperor stood beneath the great dome, looked around at the magnificent building, and declared, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." He was referring to the ancient Temple of Solomon, which had long been considered one of the greatest sacred buildings in history. Justinian believed his cathedral had surpassed it, and in many ways, Hagia Sophia truly was unlike any building the world had seen. For nearly 1,000 years, it would remain the largest cathedral on earth. Its immense dome would inspire architects across many cultures and centuries, and its beauty would become one of the defining symbols of Constantinople itself. Beyond the cathedral's walls, life in the city continued. Ships moved steadily through the Bosporus Strait. Markets remained busy along the Golden Horn. Merchants, pilgrims, and travelers from distant lands walked the streets of the imperial capital. But above it all now stood the great dome of Hagia Sophia. Visible from the harbor and from the hills beyond the city, it became a constant reminder of the power, wealth, and ambition of the Byzantine Empire. In the centuries that followed, Hagia Sophia would witness many moments in the history of Constantinople. Coronations of emperors would take place beneath its vast dome. Religious ceremonies would fill its halls with voices and music, and travelers from distant lands would record their amazement at the beauty of the cathedral. For the people of Constantinople, Hagia Sophia was more than simply a church. It was the heart of their city, a symbol of faith, power, and the enduring importance of the capital that stood between two continents. Yet beyond the cathedral walls, the life of the empire continued to unfold. Constantinople remained not only a religious center, but also the beating heart of a vast imperial world, a place where emperors ruled, diplomats negotiated, and cultures from many lands met beside the waters of the Bosporus. And within the imperial palace nearby, the ceremonies and rituals of court life carried on every day. For the city of Constantinople was not only a center of faith, it was also the seat of emperors. And the story of life inside the Byzantine court was as elaborate and fascinating as the city itself. The life of the Byzantine court. By the middle centuries of its history, Constantinople had become far more than a busy trading city beside the waters of the Bosporus Strait. It was the center of an empire. From this city, emperors governed vast territories stretching across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Decisions made within its palace walls could affect lands thousands of kilometers away. At the heart of this imperial world stood the Great Palace of Constantinople, an enormous complex of buildings overlooking the sea. The Great Palace was not a single structure, but rather a vast network of halls, courtyards, gardens, and ceremonial rooms built over many generations. Within its walls lived the emperor and his household, along with court officials, guards, servants, and advisors. Long corridors connected different parts of the palace. Marble floors reflected the light of hanging lamps. Elaborate mosaics decorated walls and ceilings, depicting scenes from religion, mythology, and imperial history. From the terraces of the palace, one could look out across the city and the sparkling waters of the Golden Horn, where ships from distant lands arrived every day. Life within the Byzantine court followed an elaborate system of ceremonies and traditions. Visitors arriving at the palace often experienced a carefully staged sequence of events designed to demonstrate the power and majesty of the emperor. Diplomats from foreign kingdoms were sometimes guided through several halls before reaching the imperial audience chamber. In these grand spaces, decorated with columns and rich fabrics, the emperor would appear seated upon a raised throne. The atmosphere of the court was intended to inspire awe. Gold decorations shimmered in the lamplight. Guards stood silently along the walls. Officials in embroidered robes moved quietly through the chamber, ensuring that every moment of the ceremony unfolded according to tradition. To foreign visitors, the experience could feel almost theatrical. A carefully choreographed display of imperial authority. Yet beyond these formal ceremonies, daily life inside the palace was more varied. Scholars and scribes worked in quiet rooms, copying important manuscripts. Messengers arrived from distant provinces bringing news of events across the empire. Advisors and administrators met with the emperor to discuss matters of government, taxation, and diplomacy. The palace kitchens prepared food not only for the imperial household, but also for the many servants and officials who lived within the complex. Gardens within the palace grounds offered places of calm and reflection, filled with fountains and shaded walkways where members of the court could stroll in the quieter hours of the day. For a moment, imagine standing within the palace gardens during a peaceful afternoon. The sounds of the city drift faintly across the hills. Beyond the palace walls, the busy streets of Constantinople continue their daily rhythms, merchants trading in the markets, ships arriving in the harbour, fishermen casting their nets into the waters of the Bosporus. But inside the gardens, the atmosphere is calm. Water flows gently through marble fountains. Trees provide shade from the afternoon sun. Take a slow breath and picture the quiet balance between the activity of the city and the peaceful spaces within the palace. For those who lived here, this was simply another ordinary day at the center of the empire. Not far from the great palace stood another important landmark in the life of Constantinople, the vast hippodrome of Constantinople. This enormous stadium was one of the most popular gathering places in the city. Here, tens of thousands of spectators gathered to watch chariot races, one of the most exciting forms of entertainment in the ancient world. The hippodrome was also closely connected to the imperial court. The emperor had a special viewing area overlooking the races, allowing him to appear before the crowds and maintain a visible presence among the citizens of the capital. For many people in Constantinople, attending events at the Hippodrome was both entertainment and an important connection to the imperial government. It was a place where the voices of the people could sometimes be heard, cheering, celebrating, and occasionally expressing their frustrations. Meanwhile, the city beyond the palace continued to flourish. Constantinople had grown into one of the largest and wealthiest cities of its time. Its markets offered goods from across the known world. Its churches and monasteries attracted pilgrims and scholars. Its harbors remained crowded with ships carrying the resources that sustained the empire. From the perspective of those living within the imperial palace, the capital seemed both powerful and enduring. For centuries, Constantinople would remain the center of Byzantine authority, a city of emperors, ceremonies, and traditions that linked the ancient Roman world with the medieval future. Yet the empire that ruled from this magnificent city would continue to face challenges. Across distant borders, new powers were rising, and in the centuries ahead, Constantinople would need to rely not only on its wealth and traditions, but also on its formidable defenses to survive. Over time, this harbor became the gateway to a city filled with markets, warehouses, and trading districts. Merchants arriving in Constantinople brought goods from almost every corner of the ancient world. From the northern shores of the Black Sea came shipments of wheat and barley, essential for feeding the growing population of the capital. Timber from distant forests was transported south for use in shipbuilding and construction. From the eastern Mediterranean arrived olive oil, wine, and fine pottery produced in cities that had traded with Constantinople for centuries. Yet some of the most valuable goods traveled far greater distances. Silk fabrics arrived through long caravan routes stretching across Asia, linking Constantinople to the distant regions of China. Spices such as pepper and cinnamon came through trade networks that passed through India and Arabia before reaching the Mediterranean. Ivory, precious stones, and rare dyes were carried along the same routes. When these goods reached Constantinople, they were bought and sold in the markets that filled the city's streets. Walking through these markets must have been an extraordinary experience. Stalls lined the busy streets, shaded by cloth awnings that protected traders and customers from the sun. The air was filled with the sounds of bargaining voices and the movement of carts carrying goods toward the harbor. Bundles of silk were displayed beside baskets of spices. Jewelers carefully examined gems brought from distant lands. Artisans sold finely crafted metalwork, glassware, and textiles. Languages from across the known world could be heard in the markets: Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, and many others. For travelers arriving in the city for the first time, Constantinople must have seemed like a meeting place of cultures and ideas. For a moment, imagine standing within one of these markets during a warm afternoon. Sunlight filters between the buildings above the narrow street. merchants call out to passing customers offering fabrics, spices, and handmade goods. Nearby, a group of sailors unload crates of cargo that have traveled across the sea. Take a slow breath and imagine the scents carried through the air, spices from distant lands, fresh bread from nearby bakeries, and the salty breeze drifting in from the harbor. For the people of Constantinople, this lively marketplace was simply part of daily life, a place where the world seemed to gather in one city. The wealth generated by this trade helped make Constantinople one of the richest cities of its time. Taxes on goods passing through the city brought enormous revenue to the imperial government. Merchants grew prosperous from the constant flow of commerce. Craftsmen produced luxury goods that were exported to other regions of the empire. The markets of Constantinople became famous across the medieval world. Travelers wrote about the abundance of goods available in the capital and the remarkable diversity of people who could be encountered there. And because nearly all trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean passed through the Bosporus, the city's economic importance remained unmatched for centuries. Yet wealth alone could not guarantee the safety of such an important city. The riches of Constantinople made it a tempting target for enemies who hoped to control the trade routes passing through its waters. Fortunately for the people of the city, their capital possessed one of the most formidable defensive systems ever constructed. Across the landward side of Constantinople rose a series of immense fortifications that protected the city from invasion. These fortifications became known as the Theodosian Walls. And, for nearly 1,000 years, these walls would help keep the city safe from the armies that came to challenge its power. The Great Walls that protected the city. For centuries, the wealth and importance of Constantinople attracted the attention of rival powers. The city controlled one of the most valuable trade routes in the world, linking the Black Sea with the Mediterranean through the narrow waters of the Bosporus Strait. Its markets were filled with goods from distant lands. Its harbor was crowded with ships, and its position between continents made it one of the most desirable cities to control. Because of this, the emperors of Constantinople understood that the capital would always need strong defenses. The sea already protected the city on two sides. The Golden Horn sheltered the northern harbor, while the waters of the Bosporus guarded the eastern shore. But the western side of the city, the landward approach, remained vulnerable. To secure this frontier, the Byzantine emperors constructed one of the most formidable defensive systems in the ancient world. The walls were built during the reign of the Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century. Stretching roughly 6.5 kilometers across the western edge of the city, the defensive system was designed with extraordinary care. It was not simply a single wall. Instead, the defenses consisted of several layers working together to protect the capital. First came a wide moat, designed to slow the advance of approaching armies. Beyond the moat stood an outer wall, reinforced with towers that allowed defenders to observe enemy movements. Behind this stood the main defensive wall, a massive structure rising high above the surrounding land, punctuated by dozens of large towers positioned at regular intervals. These towers allowed archers and soldiers to defend the city from above. Together, these layers formed a defensive system that few armies in history could overcome. For the people living inside Constantinople, the walls were a constant presence. From many parts of the city, the towers could be seen rising along the distant hills. Guards regularly patrolled the fortifications, watching the countryside beyond the city. Large gates allowed travelers and merchants to enter the capital, but these entrances were carefully monitored. Each evening, the gates were closed to ensure the safety of the city during the night. For a moment, imagine standing upon the walls as evening approaches. The sun is slowly setting beyond the western horizon. From the towers, you can see the countryside stretching far into the distance. Fields, small villages, and winding roads lie beyond the city's boundary. Inside the walls, the lights of Constantinople begin to glow as lamps are lit in homes and markets. Take a slow breath and picture the quiet strength of these great fortifications. For the people living here, the walls were more than just stone and mortar. They were a promise of safety, a barrier between the bustling life of the capital and the uncertainties of the wider world. Over the centuries, many armies would attempt to capture Constantinople. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and others marched toward the city, hoping to claim its wealth and power. Yet again and again, the Theodosian walls held firm. Their strength, combined with the city's natural protection from the surrounding seas, made Constantinople one of the most secure capitals in history. For nearly 1,000 years, these fortifications helped ensure that the city remained unconquered. Travelers arriving at the capital often wrote about the awe-inspiring sight of the walls rising above the landscape. To them, Constantinople appeared almost invincible. A city protected not only by its wealth and influence, but also by one of the greatest defensive systems ever constructed. Yet even the strongest walls cannot guarantee safety forever. Beyond the borders of the Byzantine Empire, new powers were slowly rising. Empires change, trade routes shift, and the balance of power in the world rarely remains the same for long. But for many centuries, Constantinople continued to stand strong beside the Bosporus, protected by its great walls, prosperous through its trade, and admired by travelers who saw it as one of the most remarkable cities on earth. Still, the story of Constantinople was far from over. For this city between continents would continue to serve as a meeting place of cultures, religions, and ideas, a crossroads where the worlds of Europe and Asia would come together. Constantinople, the crossroads of civilizations. For centuries, Constantinople stood at one of the most remarkable meeting points on earth. The city rested beside the narrow waters of the Bosporus Strait, a passage through which ships from distant lands traveled every day. To the north lay the Black Sea, surrounded by fertile regions that produced grain, timber, and other essential goods. To the south stretched the Mediterranean, connecting Constantinople to the great ports of Greece, Egypt, Italy, and the wider world. Caravans traveling overland routes from Asia also approached the city, carrying goods and ideas that had crossed deserts, mountains, and distant kingdoms. Because of this geography, Constantinople gradually became more than just an imperial capital. It became a place where cultures met. Travelers arriving in Constantinople often encountered people from many different parts of the world. Greek merchants negotiated with traders from Syria and Arabia. Sailors from Italian cities such as Venice and Genoa arrived with cargo and news from Western Europe. Envoys from distant kingdoms traveled to the imperial palace to negotiate alliances or discuss matters of diplomacy. Pilgrims passed through the city on their way to sacred destinations across the Christian world. Walking through the streets of Constantinople, a visitor might hear many languages spoken: Greek, Latin, Arabic, Armenian, Persian, and others carried by travelers who had journeyed across continents. The city's markets reflected this diversity. Silks from Asia were sold beside spices from India. Glassware from the Eastern Mediterranean appeared alongside textiles produced in Byzantine workshops. Jewelers displayed gems that had traveled through many lands before arriving in the capital. Ships unloading cargo along the Golden Horn brought not only goods but also stories and knowledge from distant regions. Ideas traveled along the same routes as merchants and sailors. Through these constant exchanges, Constantinople became one of the most culturally vibrant cities of its time. For a moment, imagine standing along the harbor at midday. The docks are busy with activity. Sailors secure ropes to wooden piers, while workers unload crates from ships that have crossed the sea. Nearby, merchants speak in several languages as they inspect the cargo. Above the harbor, the city rises across the hills, crowned by churches and palaces that overlook the water. Take a slow breath and picture the quiet rhythm beneath the movement. Ships arrive, ships depart. For centuries, this steady flow of travelers and goods shaped the life of Constantinople. For the people who lived here, the meeting of cultures was simply part of everyday life. The city's position between continents also gave it an important role in diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors frequently traveled to Constantinople to meet the Byzantine Emperor. These meetings often took place within the grand halls of the Great Palace of Constantinople, where carefully arranged ceremonies demonstrated the wealth and prestige of the empire. Diplomacy was a powerful tool of the Byzantine state. Rather than relying only on military force, emperors often used negotiation, alliances, and strategic gifts to maintain influence across the region. Through these efforts, Constantinople maintained connections with many neighboring powers. Religion also played an important role in the city's identity. Constantinople had become one of the most important centers of Christianity, alongside cities such as Rome and Alexandria. Pilgrims and theologians traveled to the capital to participate in religious discussions and church councils that helped shape Christian belief. At the center of the city stood the magnificent cathedral of Hagia Sophia, its vast dome rising above the skyline as a symbol of faith and imperial authority. For many visitors, the cathedral alone was enough to demonstrate the power and beauty of Constantinople. Through trade, diplomacy, and religion, Constantinople became a true crossroads of civilizations. Here, ideas passed between cultures, goods moved between continents, and the traditions of many peoples blended within a single city. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople served as a bridge between worlds, a place where Europe met Asia, where ancient Roman traditions continued into the medieval age, and where travelers from many lands gathered beside the waters of the Bosporus. Yet among the most important contributions of Constantinople was something less visible than its markets or monuments. Within its libraries and schools, scholars quietly preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to history. And this dedication to learning would play a crucial role in the centuries to come. Scholars and the preservation of knowledge. For all its wealth, trade, and imperial power, Constantinople was also a city of learning. Within its walls lived scholars, scribes, and teachers who devoted their lives to studying and preserving knowledge from the ancient world. This work often took place quietly, far from the busy markets of the Golden Horn or the ceremonies of the imperial palace. Yet it would prove to be one of the most important contributions the city ever made to human history. Long before the rise of Constantinople, the ancient Greek world had produced remarkable works of philosophy, science, and literature. Thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Hippocrates had written texts that explored ideas about mathematics, medicine, ethics, astronomy, and the natural world. These writings formed part of the intellectual heritage of the Roman and Byzantine worlds. But preserving such works required careful effort. Books in the ancient world were not printed as they are today. They were written by hand, often on parchment or papyrus. If copies were not carefully maintained, they could easily disappear over time. For this reason, scholars in Constantinople spent countless hours copying manuscripts so that the knowledge contained within them would survive. Within quiet scriptoria, rooms dedicated to writing and copying texts, scribes sat at wooden desks illuminated by the light of oil lamps. Carefully, line by line, they copied the words of ancient authors. Some manuscripts contained philosophical works that explored questions about human life and the nature of the universe. Others recorded scientific observations about medicine, geometry, and astronomy. There were also histories, poems, and works of literature that told the stories of earlier civilizations. Through patient effort, generations of scholars ensured that these texts continued to exist. For a moment, imagine one of these quiet rooms within the city. Outside, Constantinople continues its busy rhythm. Ships arrive through the Bosporus. Merchants trade in the markets. Crowds gather in the streets near the palace. But inside the small chamber of a library, the atmosphere is different. A single lamp glows beside a wooden desk. A scholar slowly writes on a sheet of parchment, carefully copying words written many centuries earlier. Take a slow breath and picture the quiet concentration of this moment. For the people working here, the task was simple but important: to ensure that knowledge from the past would not be forgotten. Constantinople eventually became home to important centers of learning. Among them was the University of Constantinople, which offered education in subjects such as philosophy, law, medicine, and rhetoric. Students from across the empire traveled to the capital to study with respected teachers. Here they learned not only the teachings of Christianity, but also the ideas of classical Greek thinkers whose works had survived through careful preservation. Because of this effort, many ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost continued to exist through the centuries. Later generations of scholars in Europe would eventually rediscover many of these works, helping to inspire the intellectual movement known as the Renaissance. In this way, the quiet work of Byzantine scholars played an important role in preserving the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. The people of Constantinople may not always have realized the significance of this work. To them, copying manuscripts and studying ancient texts were simply part of the cultural life of their city. But through centuries of careful effort, these scholars became guardians of knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. While armies marched and empires rose and fell across the surrounding regions, the libraries and schools of Constantinople continued their quiet work, preserving ideas, sharing knowledge, and maintaining a bridge between the ancient world and the generations that would follow. Yet despite its wealth, learning, and powerful defenses, the Byzantine Empire would not always enjoy stability. Beyond the city's great walls, political struggles and new rival powers were beginning to reshape the world. And in the centuries to come, Constantinople would face challenges that tested the strength of the empire that ruled from its shores. The challenges of empire. For many centuries, Constantinople stood as one of the most powerful and enduring cities in the world. Its harbors remained busy with ships from distant lands. Its markets continued to attract merchants from across continents. And its great cathedral of Hagia Sophia still rose above the skyline, its vast dome visible from far across the waters of the Bosporus Strait. Yet no empire remains unchanged forever. Over time, the Byzantine Empire faced growing pressures from many directions. Across its borders, new powers were emerging. Political struggles sometimes weakened the authority of the emperors, and distant provinces that had once been securely governed from Constantinople occasionally slipped beyond imperial control. The story of the Byzantine world became one of constant adjustment, defending borders, managing alliances, and responding to new challenges as they appeared. One of the earliest and most persistent threats came from the powerful Sasanian Empire, which ruled vast territories to the east. For generations, Byzantine and Persian forces fought along the eastern frontier. These wars were often long and exhausting, drawing resources away from the capital and placing great strain on the empire. Even when peace returned, the borders remained fragile. But the Persians were not the only rivals facing Constantinople. During the 7th century, a new and rapidly expanding power emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. The rise of Islamic states led to the creation of the Umayyad Caliphate, whose territories quickly spread across lands that had once been controlled by Byzantium. Large areas of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa were gradually lost to the empire. These regions had long been important sources of wealth and resources. Their loss forced Constantinople to adapt to a changing political landscape. Despite these setbacks, the city itself remained remarkably resilient. The powerful Theodosian walls continued to guard the capital. Several times, large armies approached the city hoping to conquer it. Yet again and again, the defenders of Constantinople managed to resist. One famous example occurred during the early 8th century, when forces of the Umayyad Caliphate attempted to capture the city. The siege lasted many months, but Constantinople held firm. Its walls, combined with the protection offered by the surrounding seas, made the capital extremely difficult to conquer. The defenders also used a powerful weapon known as Greek fire, a mysterious substance that could burn even on water. Launched from ships, Greek fire helped repel enemy fleets attempting to approach the city. To the attackers, the sight of flames spreading across the water must have been both terrifying and bewildering. For a moment, imagine the view from the city walls during one of these tense periods. Far beyond the fortifications, the camps of an enemy army stretch across the landscape. Fires burn in the distance as soldiers prepare for the long siege ahead. Yet, inside the walls of Constantinople, life continues. Merchants still open their shops. Church bells ring in the morning air. Ships continue moving through the Bosporus, bringing supplies into the harbor. Take a slow breath and picture the quiet determination of the people living within the city. For them, the walls of Constantinople were more than stone. They were a shield that had protected their city for generations. Through the centuries, the Byzantine Empire gradually adapted to these changing circumstances. Territories were lost, but the empire reorganized itself around the regions that remained under its control. New administrative systems were developed. Military reforms strengthened the empire's ability to defend its borders. And the capital itself remained a center of stability and authority. For travelers arriving in Constantinople, the city still appeared magnificent. Its churches and palaces stood proudly above the harbour. Its markets continued to attract traders from many lands, and its long history as a crossroads between continents remained unchanged. Yet the challenges faced by the empire were not only external. Internal disagreements sometimes created difficulties as well. Religious debates within the Christian world occasionally caused tension among different regions of the empire. Political rivalries at court could also lead to periods of instability. Despite these struggles, Constantinople endured. Generation after generation, the city adapted to new realities while maintaining its role as the center of Byzantine life. For nearly 1,000 years after its founding, Constantinople remained one of the greatest capitals on earth. Its strength came not only from its walls or its armies, but also from its ability to adjust to a changing world. Still, even the most resilient empires eventually face moments of profound crisis. And one of the most dramatic events in the city's long history would arrive unexpectedly in the early 13th century. An army that had set out for distant lands would instead turn toward Constantinople itself. This event would become known as the Fourth Crusade, and its consequences would shake the Byzantine world in ways few people could have imagined. The Fourth Crusade. By the beginning of the 13th century, Constantinople had stood for nearly 900 years. Its walls still guarded the western approach to the city. Its harbours remained active, with ships moving through the Bosporus Strait, and its great cathedral of Hagia Sophia still rose above the skyline, shining in the sunlight above the city's hills. To travellers arriving from distant lands, Constantinople appeared wealthy, ancient, and secure. Yet beneath this outward strength, the Byzantine Empire had slowly grown weaker over the centuries. Territories once controlled by the empire had been lost. Political disputes sometimes divided the leadership of the state, and rival powers across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean were beginning to grow stronger. It was during this time that an event unfolded which few people could have predicted. An army that had originally set out to fight in the Holy Land would eventually turn its attention toward Constantinople itself. This army was part of the Fourth Crusade. The Crusades were a series of campaigns organized by Christian kingdoms of Western Europe. Their original goal had been to capture or defend sacred sites in the Middle East, particularly the city of Jerusalem. Thousands of knights and soldiers from across Europe joined the Fourth Crusade, hoping to travel east and continue these campaigns. However, the Crusaders faced serious difficulties before their journey even began. They lacked sufficient ships and money to transport their army across the Mediterranean. To solve this problem, they turned to one of the most powerful maritime cities of the time, Venice. The Venetians agreed to provide ships for the crusading army, but the cost was enormous. When the Crusaders struggled to pay the full amount, their plans began to change. Events soon took an unexpected turn. Political disputes within the Byzantine Empire led one claimant to the imperial throne to seek help from the Crusaders. This man promised financial rewards and military support if the Crusaders helped restore him to power in Constantinople. For the leaders of the crusade, this proposal seemed like a possible solution to their financial difficulties. And so, instead of sailing directly toward the Middle East, the crusading army traveled toward the Byzantine capital. In the summer of 1203, their ships appeared before the walls of Constantinople. For a moment, imagine the scene from the city itself. From the towers of the Theodosian walls, guards look out across the sea. On the horizon, a fleet of ships approaches. Their sails fill the water as they move slowly toward the harbor. Inside the city, news spreads quickly. People gather along the streets and towers, wondering why a crusading army from Western Europe has come to their capital. Take a slow breath and picture the uncertainty of that moment. For centuries, Constantinople had stood as a powerful Christian city. Few could have imagined that fellow Christians might soon attack it. Tensions between the Crusaders and the people of Constantinople quickly increased. After a period of conflict and negotiation, the Crusaders managed to enter the city and install the claimant they supported as emperor. But the situation remained unstable. The promises of payment made to the Crusaders proved difficult to fulfill. Political unrest continued within the capital. Relations between the crusading army and the citizens of Constantinople deteriorated rapidly. Finally, in 1204, the situation erupted into open conflict. Crusader forces launched a full assault on the city. Despite the strength of its walls, Constantinople was eventually breached. For the first time in nearly 9 centuries, the capital of the Byzantine Empire had fallen to an invading army. What followed was one of the most shocking episodes in medieval history. For several days, the city was looted. Many buildings were damaged or destroyed. Churches, palaces, and homes were stripped of treasures that had been accumulated over centuries. Even the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia was not spared. Relics, artworks, and valuable objects were taken by the victors. Some of these items would later appear in churches and museums across Europe. Pause for a moment and imagine the city during those difficult days. Smoke drifts above parts of the skyline. The once quiet streets are filled with confusion and movement. Yet beyond the walls, the waters of the Bosporus continue their steady flow. Ships still move across the strait. The sea remains unchanged, even as the city itself faces one of the most difficult moments in its history. Take a slow breath and picture the long passage of time. Empires rise and fall. Cities change, but the landscape around Constantinople endures. After the conquest of 1204, the Byzantine Empire was temporarily replaced by a new political state created by the Crusaders, known as the Latin Empire. However, this new empire struggled to maintain control over the region. Meanwhile, Byzantine leaders who had escaped the city established successor states in other parts of the former empire. One of these, based in the city of Nicaea, eventually gathered enough strength to challenge the Latin rulers. In 1261, Byzantine forces successfully recaptured Constantinople, restoring the Byzantine Empire to its historic capital. Yet the damage caused by the events of the Fourth Crusade would have lasting consequences. The empire never fully recovered its former strength. Although Constantinople remained an important city, its population and resources had been greatly reduced. The empire that ruled from its walls was no longer as powerful as it had once been. And beyond its borders, new states were gradually rising that would one day challenge the Byzantine world once again. The story of Constantinople was entering a new and uncertain chapter, one in which the once mighty empire would struggle to maintain its position in a rapidly changing world. A city that slowly weakens. After the dramatic events of the Fourth Crusade, the city of Constantinople was no longer the same. Although Byzantine forces eventually recaptured the capital in 1261, restoring the empire to its historic home, the damage left by the years of occupation was deep and difficult to repair. Many parts of the city had been looted or destroyed. Treasures that had once filled churches and palaces had been carried away to Western Europe. Population levels had declined, and some districts that had once been lively neighborhoods now stood quiet and partially abandoned. Constantinople was still a remarkable city, but it was no longer the wealthy and powerful capital it had once been. The empire itself had also changed. Territories that had once been securely governed from the city were now controlled by other powers. New states had emerged across the eastern Mediterranean, and the Byzantine Empire struggled to maintain authority beyond its shrinking borders. Despite these difficulties, life within Constantinople continued. Ships still passed through the narrow waters of the Bosporus Strait. Merchants continued trading along the harbor of the Golden Horn, and the great dome of Hagia Sophia still rose above the skyline, visible from far across the sea. Yet visitors arriving during these later centuries sometimes noticed the signs of change. Some districts that had once been filled with homes and markets were quieter than before. Sections of the Great Walls required constant repair. The empire that ruled from Constantinople now relied heavily on diplomacy and alliances rather than the vast armies it had once commanded. For a moment, imagine walking through the streets of the city during these later years. The The stone roads still wind through neighborhoods filled with churches and old buildings. But here and there, empty spaces appear where houses once stood. In the distance, the towers of the Theodosian walls still rise across the western hills, guarding the city as they had done for centuries. Along the harbor, ships drift quietly beside the docks. Take a slow breath and imagine the calm rhythm of the sea beside the aging capital. For the people who lived here, Constantinople was still their home, a city filled with memories of greatness, even as the world around it slowly changed. During these centuries, the Byzantine emperors worked constantly to preserve what remained of their empire. They strengthened diplomatic ties with neighboring states and negotiated alliances when possible. Italian maritime cities such as Venice and Genoa became important trading partners. Their merchants established trading districts within Constantinople itself, bringing new economic activity to the harbor. Yet these relationships also reflected the changing balance of power. Where Byzantium had once dominated Mediterranean commerce, the empire now relied increasingly on foreign merchants to sustain its trade networks. At the same time, a new power was rising to the east. Across the lands of Anatolia, Turkish states were gradually expanding their influence. Among them was a small but growing principality led by the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. At first, the Ottomans controlled only a limited territory, but over time, their power grew steadily. Cities, fortresses, and provinces that had once belonged to Byzantium gradually came under their control. As the 14th and 15th centuries approached, the empire surrounding Constantinople grew smaller. The capital itself remained strong behind its walls. But beyond those walls, the world was changing. Pause for a moment and imagine the city at sunset. The last light of the day falls across the domes and towers of Constantinople. The waters of the Bosporus glow softly as ships pass through the strait. From the hills above the harbor, the city still appears magnificent. Take a slow breath and picture the quiet dignity of this ancient capital. For nearly 1,000 years, it had stood between continents, a meeting place of cultures, a center of trade, faith, and empire. Yet the long story of Constantinople was approaching one of its most dramatic chapters. Beyond the borders of the shrinking Byzantine world, a new ruler was preparing to challenge the city that had resisted so many conquerors before. His name was Mehmed II, and the siege he would soon begin would change the course of history forever. The rising Ottoman Empire. By the early 15th century, the once vast Byzantine Empire had grown small. Its territories, which had once stretched across much of the eastern Mediterranean, had gradually been reduced to a handful of scattered regions. At the center of what remained stood the ancient city of Constantinople. The city still possessed its great churches and palaces, Its mighty Theodosian walls continued to guard the western approach, and its position beside the Bosporus Strait still made it one of the most valuable locations in the region. But beyond the walls of Constantinople, the political landscape of the eastern Mediterranean had changed dramatically. A new and powerful state had emerged. This rising power was the Ottoman Empire. The origins of the Ottoman state were relatively modest. In the late 13th century, a Turkish leader named Osman I established a small principality in northwestern Anatolia. At that time, the region was filled with competing states and frontier territories left behind after the decline of Byzantine authority in Asia Minor. Osman and his followers gradually expanded their territory through a combination of military campaigns, alliances, and settlement. Over time, this small frontier principality grew into a powerful state. Successive Ottoman rulers continued to expand their influence across Anatolia and into southeastern Europe. Cities and fortresses that had once belonged to Byzantium slowly fell under Ottoman control. By the 14th century, the Ottomans had crossed into the Balkans and established themselves as a major force in the region. Despite these changes, Constantinople itself remained unconquered. The city's powerful walls still protected it, and although the Byzantine Empire had grown smaller, the capital continued to stand as a symbol of its long history and cultural importance. For the Ottoman rulers, however, Constantinople represented something more than a historic city. It was a strategic prize. Whoever controlled the city would command the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. They would also inherit the prestige of ruling from one of the most famous capitals in the world. For many Ottoman leaders, capturing Constantinople became an important ambition. This ambition would eventually fall to one particular ruler. In 1451, a young sultan named Mehmed II came to power. Mehmed was only 19 years old when he began his reign. Yet he was already determined to accomplish what many previous rulers had attempted but failed to achieve. He intended to capture Constantinople. Mehmed understood that such a task would require careful preparation. The walls of the city had resisted sieges for centuries. Any attempt to conquer Constantinople would need new strategies and powerful weapons. Over the following months, the Ottoman Sultan began gathering the resources necessary for the campaign. Engineers and craftsmen constructed enormous cannons designed to breach the famous city walls. Armies were assembled from across the Ottoman territories, and along the shores of the Bosporus, Mehmed ordered the construction of a great fortress known as Rumeli Hisari. This fortress stood directly across from an older Byzantine stronghold, allowing the Ottomans to control ship traffic moving through the strait. Gradually, the city of Constantinople found itself surrounded by a growing Ottoman presence. For a moment, imagine the view from the towers of Constantinople during these tense months. From the city walls, countryside stretches across the hills to the west. In the distance, Ottoman forces prepare their camps. Caravans move along the roads carrying supplies to the gathering army. Yet inside the city, daily life continues. Church bells ring in the morning. Ships still move through the harbor of the Golden Horn. Take a slow breath and picture the quiet uncertainty of the moment. For the people living within the ancient capital, the threat approaching their city was impossible to ignore. Within Constantinople, the final Byzantine emperor prepared to defend the city. His name was Constantine the 11th Paleologus. He ruled an empire that had grown small but still carried the legacy of more than 1,000 years of history. Constantine the 11th understood the seriousness of the situation. The forces gathering beyond the walls were unlike anything the city had faced in generations. Yet he also knew that Constantinople had survived many sieges before. For centuries, the walls and the sea had protected the capital from invaders. Now those defenses would face their greatest test. In the spring of 1453, the armies of the Ottoman Empire began moving toward the city. The long history of Constantinople was approaching one of its most decisive moments. For nearly 11 centuries, the city had stood as the center of the Byzantine world. Soon, the ancient capital would face the most famous siege in its long and remarkable story. The Siege of Constantinople. In the spring of 1453, the long history of Constantinople approached its most dramatic moment. For more than 1,000 years, the city had stood between continents, protected by the waters of the Bosporus Strait and by the immense strength of the Theodosian walls. Many armies had attempted to conquer the city before, yet generation after generation, those walls had held firm. Now, however, a new and determined force had arrived outside the capital. The army of the Ottoman Empire, led by the young Sultan Mehmed II, prepared to begin one of the most famous sieges in history. In early April, Ottoman forces arrived outside the western walls of the city. Thousands of soldiers established camps across the fields beyond Constantinople. Tents stretched across the hills as the army prepared for the long siege ahead. Within the city, the Byzantine defenders gathered their limited forces. The Emperor Constantine the 11th Paleologus personally helped organize the defense. Although the Byzantine Empire had grown small, the city still possessed formidable defenses. The ancient walls that had protected Constantinople for centuries were repaired and strengthened. Soldiers and volunteers took positions along the towers and battlements. Ships were anchored across the entrance of the Golden Horn, protected by a massive chain stretched across the water to prevent enemy vessels from entering the harbor. Despite the determination of the defenders, the balance of forces was heavily in favor of the Ottomans. Mehmed's army was far larger than the forces available within the city, and the Ottomans possessed a powerful new weapon. One of the most remarkable features of the siege was the use of enormous cannons. These great guns had been constructed specifically for the campaign. Some were so large that they required teams of oxen to transport them across the countryside. Once positioned outside the walls, the cannons began firing massive stone projectiles toward the ancient fortifications. Each impact shook the walls that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. Although the Theodosian walls were still strong, these powerful weapons gradually began to damage sections of the defenses. Day after day, the bombardment continued. For a moment, imagine the view from the city walls during those tense weeks. Below the fortifications, the camps of the Ottoman army stretch across the fields. The sound of distant cannon fire echoes through the air. Yet within the city, life continues with a quiet determination. Citizens gather in churches to pray. Soldiers patrol the walls through the night. Take a slow breath and picture the courage of those defending the ancient capital. For them, this was more than a battle. It was the defense of their home, their faith, and the legacy of centuries. Meanwhile, Mehmed II continued searching for ways to overcome the city's defenses. One of his most ingenious strategies involved the harbor itself. Because the entrance to the Golden Horn was blocked by a heavy defensive chain, Ottoman ships could not sail directly into the harbor. Instead, Mehmed ordered a remarkable operation. Using greased wooden tracks laid across the hills north of the harbor, Ottoman forces transported ships overland. Dozens of vessels were slowly pulled across the hillside and launched into the Golden Horn behind the city's defensive barrier. When the defenders saw Ottoman ships suddenly appearing inside the harbor, it must have been a shocking sight. The city now faced threats from multiple directions. The siege continued for nearly 2 months. The defenders fought with determination, repairing damaged walls and repelling assaults whenever possible. Yet the constant bombardment gradually weakened the defenses. On the night of May 28, 1453, the Ottoman army prepared for a final assault. Across the camps outside the city, soldiers gathered for the attack that would begin before dawn. Inside Constantinople, the Emperor Constantine the 11th spent his final evening among his soldiers and citizens. According to historical accounts, people gathered in churches throughout the city to pray together during those last hours. Imagine the quiet atmosphere of that night. The streets of Constantinople are still. Above the rooftops, the great dome of Hagia Sophia rises against the dark sky. Beyond the walls, thousands of soldiers wait in the darkness. Take a slow breath and picture the silence before the final moment. For more than 11 centuries, Constantinople had stood as one of the great cities of the world. Now, its long history was approaching a turning point. In the early morning hours of May 29th, 1453, the final assault began. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers advanced toward the damaged sections of the walls. After fierce fighting, Ottoman forces finally broke through the defenses. As the attackers entered the city, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine the 11th is believed to have joined the fighting and died in the battle. With his death, the long history of the Byzantine Empire came to an end. For the first time since its founding in 330 AD, Constantinople had been conquered. The city that had once been the capital of the Eastern Roman world now entered a new chapter. Under Ottoman rule, Constantinople would soon become the center of a different empire, one that would shape the history of the region for centuries to come. Yet even in defeat, the legacy of Constantinople remained extraordinary. For more than 1,000 years, it had stood as one of the greatest cities on earth, a meeting place of cultures, a center of faith and learning, and a bridge between the worlds of Europe and Asia, the end of the Byzantine Empire. When the walls of Constantinople were finally breached on the morning of May the 29th, 1453, one of the longest chapters in world history came to an end. For more than 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire had continued the legacy of the ancient Roman world. Its emperors ruled from the city beside the Bosporus Strait, governing lands that once stretched across much of the eastern Mediterranean. But on that morning, the city fell to the army of the Ottoman Empire, led by the young Sultan Mehmed II. With the fall of the city, the Byzantine Empire itself came to an end. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, is believed to have died during the fighting near the city walls. Unlike many rulers who fled in times of defeat, Constantine the 11th chose to remain with his soldiers. Historical accounts describe him removing his imperial robes before joining in the defense of the city during the final assault. His exact fate remains uncertain, but he is widely remembered as the last emperor of a long and remarkable imperial tradition. As Ottoman forces entered the city, Constantinople experienced the chaotic moments that often followed the fall of a fortified capital. For a time, soldiers moved through the streets searching for supplies and securing key locations. Many citizens sought refuge in churches and buildings throughout the city. Among the places where people gathered was the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, whose vast interior had witnessed centuries of imperial ceremonies and religious services. Within its walls, people hoped the sacred space might offer protection during the uncertain hours following the conquest. For a moment, imagine the city during that early morning. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the skyline. Smoke drifts above parts of the city after the long battle. Beyond the rooftops, the waters of the Bosporus continue their quiet movement between two seas. take a slow breath and picture the stillness that sometimes follows great events. Empires that seemed eternal can change in a single moment. Yet the landscape remains. The hills, the harbour, and the narrow passage between continents that first gave this city its importance. For Sultan Mehmed II, capturing Constantinople was an extraordinary achievement. The city had long been considered one of the most difficult places in the world to conquer. Its powerful walls, its strategic location, and its long history had given it an almost legendary reputation. Now the young Ottoman ruler had succeeded where many others had failed. Shortly after entering the city, Mehmed rode through the streets toward Hagia Sophia. According to historical accounts, he ordered that the cathedral be protected and preserved. The building would soon become an important religious site within the Ottoman world. Although the Byzantine Empire had ended, the city itself did not disappear. Constantinople had always been too valuable, too strategically located, and too historically significant to remain abandoned. Instead, it would soon become the capital of a new empire. Under Ottoman rule, the city would begin another long chapter in its history. New buildings would rise across the skyline. New communities would settle within its neighborhoods. And the city that had once served as the heart of the Byzantine world would continue its life under a different name and a different empire. Yet, even as the political order changed, the memory of the Byzantine past remained deeply connected to the city. For centuries, Constantinople had been a center of Christian culture, learning, and imperial authority. Its scholars had preserved ancient knowledge. Its architects had built structures that inspired the world. And its walls had defended the capital through countless challenges. The fall of the city in 1453 marked the end of one era. But the story of the city itself was far from over. Because the ancient capital beside the Bosporus would soon begin a new life as the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a city known to the world by another name: Istanbul. Constantinople becomes Istanbul. After the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the city entered a new chapter in its long history. For the victorious Ottoman ruler, Mehmed II, capturing the city was not only a military triumph, it was also the beginning of a new imperial capital. Mehmed understood that Constantinople held extraordinary importance. Its location beside the Bosporus Strait made it one of the most valuable cities in the world. Rather than abandoning the conquered capital, the Sultan decided to restore and transform it. The city would become the center of the Ottoman Empire. In the months following the conquest, Mehmed II began encouraging people from many regions of the empire to settle in the city. Families, craftsmen, merchants, and scholars arrived from across Anatolia, the Balkans and the eastern Mediterranean. Gradually, neighborhoods that had been damaged during the siege were rebuilt. Markets reopened. Homes were repaired. The harbor of the Golden Horn once again filled with ships carrying goods and travelers. The city slowly returned to life. One of the most visible changes involved the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia. Under Ottoman rule, the cathedral was converted into a mosque. Minarets were added beside its massive dome, and the building soon became one of the most important religious sites in the Ottoman capital. Although its purpose had changed, Hagia Sophia remained one of the most magnificent buildings in the city. Visitors arriving from distant lands continued to marvel at its vast interior and towering dome. Over the following decades, new landmarks began appearing across the skyline. Ottoman rulers constructed mosques, palaces, schools, and public buildings that reflected the artistic traditions of the Islamic world. Among the most important of these new structures was the Topkapi Palace, built near the site of the old Byzantine Imperial Palace. From this palace complex overlooking the Bosporus, Ottoman sultans would govern their expanding empire for centuries. Markets and bazaars also flourished. The famous Grand Bazaar developed into one of the largest and most active marketplaces in the world. Within its labyrinth of streets and shops, merchants sold textiles, jewelry, spices, carpets, and countless other goods brought from distant regions. Once again, the city became a vibrant center of international trade. For a moment, imagine the city several decades after the conquest. The skyline has begun to change. Minarets rise beside ancient domes. Ships crowd the waters of the Bosporus. The markets are alive with traders speaking many languages. Take a slow breath and picture the calm movement of life returning to the ancient city. For the people who lived here, the transformation of Constantinople into a new capital was not a sudden event, but a gradual process unfolding over many years. During this time, the city increasingly became known by a new name. The word Istanbul began to replace the older imperial title in everyday speech. Although variations of the name had been used informally for centuries, it gradually became the common way to refer to the city during the Ottoman era. Under Ottoman rule, Istanbul would grow into one of the largest and most influential cities in the world. The empire governed from its palaces would stretch across southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. For centuries, travelers arriving in the city described it as one of the most remarkable capitals on earth. A place where cultures met, where trade flowed between continents, and where the long history of Byzantium blended with the traditions of the Ottoman world. Yet even as the city changed, its deeper identity remained connected to the geography that had shaped it from the beginning. The waters of the Bosporus still flowed quietly in Asia. Ships still traveled between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and the hills overlooking the harbor still held the memories of the many civilizations that had called this place their home. The story of Constantinople, or Istanbul, was never just the story of one empire. It was the story of a city that stood between worlds. The eternal city between worlds. For more than 16 centuries, the city once known as Constantinople has stood beside the narrow waters of the Bosporus Strait. Empires have risen and fallen along its shores. Armies have marched toward its walls. Merchants and travelers from distant lands have walked its streets. Yet through all these changes, the city itself has endured. Today, it is known as Istanbul, one of the largest and most vibrant cities in the world. Across its skyline rise the monuments of many centuries. The great dome of Hagia Sophia still dominates the horizon, just as it did when it was first completed in the 6th century. Nearby stand the elegant minarets of the Blue Mosque, built during the height of the Ottoman Empire. Along the hills overlooking the water, palaces, markets, and ancient walls continue to tell the story of the many civilizations that shaped the city. Visitors walking through Istanbul today can still trace the outlines of its remarkable past. Sections of the Theodosian walls remain standing across the western side of the city. The harbors along the Golden Horn still shelter ships, just as they did when traders arrived from distant lands centuries ago. And the narrow channel of the Bosporus continues to carry vessels between two continents. For a moment, imagine standing on a hillside overlooking the city at sunset. Below you, ferries move slowly across the Bosporus. The evening light reflects across the water as the skyline of Istanbul stretches across the hills. In the distance, the domes and towers of ancient Constantinople remain visible among the buildings of the modern city. Take a slow breath and picture the quiet continuity of this place. For thousands of years, people have stood on these same hills, watching the ships pass through the strait. Merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, travelers from distant lands. Each generation saw the city through the lens of its own time. Yet the geography that first gave this place its importance has never changed. From a small Greek settlement known as Byzantium, the city grew into the capital of the Byzantine Empire. For centuries, it served as the heart of a civilization that preserved knowledge, connected cultures, and governed lands across the eastern Mediterranean. After the conquest of 1453, the city became the center of the Ottoman Empire, shaping the political and cultural life of an enormous region. Through every era, the city remained a meeting place between Europe and Asia, a gateway between seas, a crossroads where ideas, trade, and traditions moved between worlds. History often remembers the rise and fall of empires, but cities sometimes tell a different story. They survive long after the rulers who built them have passed into memory. They continue adapting, changing, and welcoming new generations. Constantinople, or Istanbul, is one of those rare cities whose story stretches across many centuries of human history. A place where ancient traditions and modern life exist side by side. As night slowly falls across the Bosporus, the lights of the city begin to glow. Ships continue their journeys through the narrow strait, a story that began beside a quiet harbor thousands of years ago, and one that continues to unfold today. As our journey through the ancient city of Constantinople comes to a close, the waters of the Bosporus continue their quiet passage between two continents. For thousands of years, ships have traveled through this narrow strait. Merchants, explorers, soldiers, and pilgrims have all passed these shores, each leaving behind a small part of their story. Empires rose here. Great cathedrals and palaces were built upon these hills. Armies once gathered beyond the city's mighty walls. Yet through every age of change, the city itself endured. Today, the skyline of modern Istanbul still reflects that long and remarkable history. The domes and minarets stand beside the waters where traders once anchored their ships, and the ancient streets still carry the echoes of countless generations who called this place home. For a moment, imagine the evening settling over the city. The lights of the harbor glow softly along the Golden Horn. Ferries cross the Bosporus in the fading light. The air is calm, and the distant sounds of the city drift quietly across the water. Take a slow breath and allow the long story of this ancient capital to settle into stillness. For more than 16 centuries, this city between continents has witnessed the passage of time, watching the world change while its waters continue to flow. And tonight, as the Bosporus moves quietly beneath the stars, the story of Constantinople rests peacefully beside the sea. Sleep well. Dream gently. Good night.